Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from around the world. Welcome back to Creation Conversations. We've got a great topic for you tonight, all to do with the Ice Age and where does that fit into biblical history and everything else that comes with it. We've got our entire panel here, as we always do. So, hi guys, how are we all doing? John, where are you? Are you still on the road?
I'm still on the road. I'm sort of in New South Wales, but on a separate time zone because we're too close to South Australia. So we're out in the wilderness. So that's where I am, Broken Hill.
And you guys, obviously, Craig, you're back in Tasmania, and Diane, you're still in Canberra.
Yes, I'm still in Canberra.
And and it's been a pretty busy week here. It's slightly cooler than it was last week, but in the UK. But there we go. Anyway, it's been sort of busy times anyway. But Craig, how are you doing with the museum and everything that's going on where you are? And I think you had a field trip recently. Is that right?
Yeah, we did, and I'll talk about that shortly, I guess. But yeah, it was a good trip and saw plenty of fossils and met some nice people, so that's been good. The museum's plugging along in our quiet sort of tourism season at the moment, but still getting a few visitors.
That's great. Well, do you want to run through your field trip report now? We can pull that up and deal with that. That's fine. I'll just pop it up on the screen for you now. There you go.
Okay, so yeah, last Saturday I took off from the show early because we were going out to Royal George. This is the sort of general layout of the area. It was a bit of a party. It was a local laboratory club, so that they weren't particularly, especially Christian people or anything, but lovely people, had a good time. This is where it is. So you can see that's a map of showing some of the fossil sites, most of which we've confirmed on the ground. And that's going to fill another nice little gap in there. And hopefully over the next 2 or 3 years or so, we'll be able to completely fill that map up and show that all of Tasmania was once underwater. And that might be difficult in the far southwest, which is very remote and difficult to get to, but we'll see how we go. We know there's sites there. So this is what it looked like on the ground. And some of the comments are there from some of the other people that were with us. They were saying things like, it's unbelievable how many fossils are here. And to think that this whole area was underwater once. And every one of those rocks that you can see there had fossils in them. Every single one of them. You couldn't help but just go and turn one over and find a fossil. And so I've got a couple to show you. This is a nice one. I haven't actually had time yet to clean the moss out that's growing in there, but you can still see the little spring mechanism that drives the opening of a brachiopod, the two-shelled organism, and that's just showing incredible design in what would usually be referred to as a primitive organism. Now there's my daughter. She came out with me and we had a great time together, and that gives you a bit of perspective on the size of this rock that two of us had to lift into the back of the ute. And that rock there is absolutely chock-a-block of shells and corals and just evidence of a mass dumping in a very turbulent event, which I think we all know what it is. There's a couple of examples of some of the fossils there. I hadn't previously collected horn corals, so that was nice to get those. And there's another coral there on the right. John might correct me. I don't think it's Fenestella. That one looks more like a hard coral stem to me.
Yeah, no, fossil Fenestella has got windows in it, hence the term fenes, which is an opening or a window in Latin. And that's definitely one of the porphyrids. So it's definitely a matte coral.
Right. Okay, great. Thanks, John. And there was, that's not a great photo, but found some brachiopods that inside the muscle part of the fossil, it had actually crystallized, and some nice crystals there. So just regarding the museum, just on Thursday we had a family come in, and the father looked very skeptical about everything. But as I progressed through the museum with him, he lightened up and opened up that he was actually a Christian, and came out with amazing how you're able to present the Bible like this. I've never seen it done like this before. And he was really enthused in the end and appreciative of what we had set out. So that was an encouraging testimony. So back over to you, Joe.
Good stuff. Looks great, Craig. Looks like some good finds there, which is really, really great. Well, here in the UK, it's been pretty busy. We've been running left, right, and centre, and we've had a meeting just about every single day this week at every single time conceivably imaginable. But it's been very, very busy, and we've got some really great and exciting news, which will be announced next week. So make sure you tune in, because that's going to be a big feature next week. Next week, we're going to be dealing on your questions and answers. So again, get your questions in. Remember, Q question, because what we'll be doing next week is that time when we spend the big bulk of the program actually just going through questions and answers. So make sure you get your questions in, and anything we haven't dealt with in any previous streams, we'll also deal with then. But we're also going to be dealing with a specific announcement to do with our UK Creation Research Museums project. So make sure you tune in for that. It's big, it's exciting, but a little treat for you that we've just had two things published here in the UK, both of which you can order online for free. And the first one is this. Now, this is the Creation News Global. Now, John, give us a bit of a background to Creation News, because you pretty much founded this way back in the beginning when it was all sort of kicking off creation-wise.
Yep. Basically, it's designed to do two things. And one is to promote the latest interesting finds that we've made, whether they be fossils or whether they be information that Diane's discovered in her trawling, as well as a ministry report, the sort of thing we're doing now, to tell people what's happening with our rocks, our fossils, our museums, our personnel, who needs prayer, finances, etc. So it's a very informative. And this one here, we have two big pages on, well, it's basically Creation Research UK Museum, isn't it? But
Absolutely.
More of that later. They can get that for free online in the UK now.
Indeed. Well, normally this is a nice printed version, right? And normally the printed version only goes out in Australia, because that's really the only place we can usually afford to send it by post, right? But this is available as a PDF read, e-read, however you want to call it, and that's completely free. So make sure you've signed up to Creation Research's updates. If you have, one of these should be coming into your electronic inbox very shortly. However, because yes, as John, you mentioned, it's got two full pages on the UK updates and everything to do with the UK Museum project, we decided, and it is, Creation News Global, not just Creation News Australia, so we've decided to print it. We've got a limited number of copies, but they are free if you would like to order one. So it's very, very easy. You just go on to creationresearchcentre.com or creationresearch.net, and on the front page, there's click here to order your free copy of the Creation News Global. Of course, if you'd like to donate, just £1 would cover the cost of printing and shipping to you. So we'd greatly appreciate if you can afford the pound to help cover our costs. And also, if you would like to order a bulk load of these, 10, 20, 50, whatever, in order to distribute to your church, you can also do that. There's a link for that on our website. So just simply go through to our UK shop, put in a donation of any amount, and you'll be able to get a bulk order of these to share around at your church or group or organisation. So get hold of these. It covers a lot of topics, as John said. In fact, Craig's on the front page. John and your wonderful wife is on there as well. We've got that remarkable sort of meteor, asteroid impacts, something weird going on there. A full report on that. We've got two full pages on the UK Museum project and what's going on in the UK, trilobites and everything else, and the USA, not forgetting as well. So grab your free copy of these, and when you do order your free copy, you will also be sent a reminder of our convention coming up in just, well, it's scarily enough, just less than a couple of months away now. It's happening in September the 26th. So this little brochure will give you all the details of what's going on, all the details of what's happening, all the speakers that'll be there, included a now completed schedule of events and everything else as well. So we'll send one of those through when you order your free copy of the Creation News Global, and I encourage you to get on and book this because we still have a deal 10% off of all your ticket price, which is ending at the end of this month. So you haven't got very long to grab hold of that if you would like it. So make sure you go online and do that now. So we've been very, very busy, not just producing the 2 pages in here, but actually doing what the 2 pages are all about. So it's very, very exciting. It's very, very busy. But let me be honest with you, I'm feeling quite weary as well. There's been a lot of stuff going on. So please pray for me. Please pray for John. Pray for Craig. Pray for Diane. Pray for Sam. Pray for all of the team in Creation Research that we would have a renewed strength and also continue to support us so we can actually continue to do all of this. So thank you all very much. Well, that's my little report. Diane, how are you doing in Australia at the moment? Because it's not just... I know you're very much involved in getting these out, but we haven't just put one of these out this week. We've had something else as well, haven't we?
Yes, we have our email newsletter as well, which just goes out. It's free as well. It just goes out as an email every few weeks. So
and that's
we
the
send one of those
news,
out
isn't it?
each week. It does have a bit of news about what's happening in the ministry. Lovely picture of Craig's daughter in the back of the utility with that huge fossil, which is really good. But also we keep a sort of watching brief on what's going out in the general scientific news, what goes out on the mainstream news services, and what sort of stories they're telling about it. And we help people to take a look at what scientific discoveries there are from a biblical point of view. And it's usually a quite eclectic mix. So this week we have the oldest fossil panda thumb. If you may have heard the term the panda's thumb. It was made rather famous by Stephen Gould. And it's one of those evolutionary stories that the panda evolved this extra sort of thumb in order to help it eat bamboo. So it changed, part of being changed from a carnivore to a vegetarian. But there's a different story about that if you start with the biblical history of the world. And we just show you how this real piece of evidence, it's an actual fossil they dug up, how that fits into the biblical history of the world. And then there's a story about hummingbirds, which are wonderful examples of design. So I'm always on the lookout for stories about hummingbirds because they're just such brilliant design. And also last week, of course, there was the big announcement about the new telescope that's sitting out there in outer space. And it's capturing pictures of more wonderful and glorious things. The heavens indeed do declare the glory of God. And of course, a whole raft of stories came out about this telescope, what it's going to tell us. And we've picked a couple of the more strange and bizarre ones, but nevertheless, they were reported in the normal media. And so we've picked up on those, so you can read those claims that are made about this telescope and also what it's really going to do for us. So I think it's a wonderful invention. It's certainly going to show us more of the glory of God. We are a very privileged generation, being able to study the heavens in all of this detail. But of course, the usual story with this technology is that it's going to prove the Big Bang Theory. Well, so far, it hasn't done that. All it's done is shown more and more of the glory of God and the wonder and power of God. And that is a good thing that we can use to draw people to the Lord Jesus Christ and to lift their sights to the glory and power of our God. So do have a look at that newsletter. If you missed it, that doesn't matter. All of the individual science news items, we archive those on their own website called the Fact File. And so you don't need to know when a particular story came out. You can just look it up using a keyword search. But if you go to the Fact File, you'll see those three things as the most recent entries. But if you want to look up something that we sent out 10 years ago or even longer than that, we've been doing it for a long time, it's all there in that archive, and you can search for that. Can we put up the website for that?
I'm sure we can.
Sam?
Sam?
Yeah, there we go.
Or you can get to it through our main site anyway. Just go to Creation Research and then click on the fact file. But it is a separate website, so you can just search for that doing a normal Google search or sort of browser search. And
link in the chat as well.
Yes,
so just give me a few minutes, and that'll soon be in the chat for you.
That's fine. Great stuff.
And Diane, there's even a look at the comments on the telescope discovering aliens. Well, let's not say any more about that. We might spook some listeners.
That was one of the claims that was made about it. Yes, you can read a bit more about that. And we do have the references as to where we got these sources from, so you can check back, trace those back.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
All right, good stuff, great stuff. Thanks for that, Diane. All right, we're just left with John and your ministry report. But once you've done that, and perhaps once you've given us a background as to what you've been doing over the last few days, maybe we should dive straight into tonight's topic, which is, of course, well, I've just put the Ice Age, right? It's a very general topic, but not only are we going to look at the background to the Ice Age or the concept of the Ice Age, a bit of the evidence for the Ice Age, but we're also going to try and fit it into that biblical context, which includes the issue of climate change. It includes the issue of adaptation. It includes the issue of how did it have anything to do with the migration of people, right? It touches quite a lot of different sort of sub areas. So we'll try and deal with some of that tonight. By no means will we deal with every single aspect of it, but we'll see how we go. John, over to you.
Okay, so what I've been doing is finding things like this. Now, it mightn't look spectacular to you, but we're out on the edge of the desert and we're having great time, good exercise, walking through the cold, windy desert. Nothing worse than a cold desert, I tell you. Hot deserts are bad enough, cold deserts are worse. But what's interesting about this is I've given it to a few people and they've picked it up with their right hand usually, because most people are right-handed. But then I've told them to swap it to their left hand. And all of a sudden, they start to look a bit mystified because it doesn't fit comfortably in your left hand. The reason it doesn't fit comfortably is that Aboriginal stone tools are made to be right-handed in the majority of cases. And only occasionally will you find a number that are left-handed. Now, it turns out that the breakdown of tools, right-handed and left-handed, actually matches the number of right-handed Aborigines versus left-handed. So they've been right and left-handed for quite a while, but most of them are right-handed, same as with Europeans. This, by the way, was a stone tool. You have a look at it. It's got curved surfaces. It's been chipped and broken just there, where we are. Go back that way. But in reality, it is beautifully shaped for only fitting in your right hand. If you try to put it in your left hand, it's just uncomfortable. It doesn't work. Your fingers don't fit in the right place, etc. So that's one thing we've been doing. And wandering through the desert, look what else has been picked up. Can you see the shape that's cut out of there? Someone's gone to a lot of trouble to cut out that little ball of flint that's in here. You see, the ordinary stone is sort of rough and it's dirty grey and orange, and that had to be cleaned off so they could actually get to the piece of flint on the inside. And then they've hit it with a stone hammer right there. Right, see where it's been hit? You see the shape that's come off? This nice curved shape going around there. Now, when I get back to the office, I intend to actually cast the rest of this stone, and what will come out of that, because I showed this to a knapping expert who's worked on Aboriginal stones for a long time, and he said, yes, that's definitely a man-made object. That's definitely where you've hit it with a rock and you've napped something. That's not N-A-P, that's K-N-A-P-P-E-D. That means to break off a section, and it's beautifully done. I mean, they would have then taken that little hand axe and they would have polished it around. So what we've got here is evidence of intelligent use of a stone to make something that wouldn't happen by itself. Yes, you can get flakes off a stone by itself. It can roll down a hill, but it never ends up as a beautifully round shape. As the guy said to me, it takes quite a lot of knowledge of how stones behave before you can actually get that. So this stone tool was itself created, even though the original stone would be the result of time and process involving the properties of the minerals that the stone axe is made from. It required an intelligent design. And whenever you've got intelligence involved, you've got a creator. It never happens by chance, no matter how long you give it. So we've been wandering through the desert, having a look at rocks and fossils. And yesterday we spent quite a bit of time both talking to an Aboriginal pastor, because I'm going to be preaching to his church on this coming Sunday. So pray for us as we talk to them, because it's a different non-European culture. And fortunately, I've had lots of experience with Aborigines. So if you want to ask me some of the things about how they got to Australia, actually, I think Craig's going to deal with that as we go through the Ice Age data related to Australia. But meanwhile, I'm going to actually move on now to the sharing section. So you guys remember, you'll have to check with me as to what we're doing. There we are. That's great. Now let's see if this thing works that I plugged in, because you might notice I'm in a different room because I'm in a different town, and I've got my clicker, but the actual link's put in a different place. Okay, can you see the question there? Can you name one big drought, flood, snow, or ice storm in the New Testament? Now, the answer is no. There was a storm on the Sea of Galilee. Now, there was a big storm on a little bit of the Mediterranean because Paul's ship foundered, right? But after that, flood, snow, ice storm. In fact, from the Roman records, we discover that 100 to 200 years after Jesus was born is an incredibly stable weather period. No ice or snow hinders anything. So don't be surprised. God actually used the Roman Empire to spread stone roads and to spread security with Roman forces right to the ends of the earth, as it were. So the missionaries already had their way prepared for them. Okay, so when we look at this issue here, it's not working, so I'll swap over to this here. In fact, my whole clicker's not working. Sam, what do I need to do? Or Joe?
You might just need to just tap on your, just click on your presentation and then start clicking left and right.
Okay, well, I've done that. All right, there we are. Can we see that now?
We've still got the question. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, we're good.
Okay, so there we are.
That might work with your clicker now as well. Just you might want to try that.
So I'll see that. But when you go back to the Old Testament, the first reference to ice, because you should know your Bible says, in the beginning everything was very good, and Adam and Eve were stark naked. So you know they were not exposed to ice at all. But in Job chapter 6, Job says his brothers have dealt deceitfully with him as a brook that's frozen. They're black. Now, I never knew what black ice was until I went to New Zealand, and they had road warnings, beware black ice. And I thought, what is this? And it warned me about a corner that was covered with black ice. And when I went round the corner, I actually didn't. I went straight off the road. I discovered it was covered with a very thin layer of black ice. You couldn't see it on the road, and you would simply slip everywhere. The first reference to ice is in association with people who couldn't be trusted. And in Job chapter 38, Job is pondering his treatment by God, and he's complaining almost. And he wants to know what's causing this. And God basically says, well, Job, I'll ask you some questions, and if you can answer these questions, then I'll answer yours. Okay, out of whose womb came the ice and the hoary frost of heaven? Who has given birth to it? The waters are hid with as a stone, and the face of the deep is frozen. Okay, now God asked Job those questions about where did the ice come from. Ice, like a baby, came quickly. Now, nobody thinks that the reference here is to someone who was pregnant and took 1 million years to give birth to the ice. That doesn't make any sense of this analogy. Babies, if you've had a pregnant wife or you know someone who's given birth, you don't spend 10 years giving birth. You're dead, the baby's dead. Out of whose womb came the ice? Where did this come from? Job didn't know. And I'll be honest, we are now thousands of years later, and I've asked professor after professor, what do we know about where the ice came from? And in most cases, they say, we have absolutely no idea. And then some will say, oh, but here's what could have happened. What's interesting is this is so tied up with climate change. When you read about the astronomy stuff, and this is a couple of years ago now, look what they're saying. If you're worried about the ice melting, because that's what this was the context, then heat is not just happening on the world. It's not just hot in England at the moment. The heat is building up right across the universe, in the galaxies. So whatever's happening climate-wise, whether it was the coming of the ice or whether it's the melting of the ice, it's something that's bigger than planet Earth. So what about the Ice Age? Now, Diane and I put this program together years ago, and let's have a good question, because I've had the advantage of traveling to almost the ends of the earth. And the one thing I've discovered is if you want to know how the ends of the earth got to be what they are, then you need to start with the one who made them. God looked at everything he made, and in the beginning, it was very good. The man and his wife were both naked. That's how good the weather was. They did not need protection from the cold. There was no need for umbrellas to protect from the heavy rain. There wouldn't be any heavy rain till Noah's flood. There's quite a few weather clues in the history of the Bible. Now, what we're going to be doing is taking you through a biblical history, and then we're looking at the evidence as we go. Because we make no apologies, we try our very best to give you a biblical perspective on the actual history and evidence that you do find. So undeniably, there's a history of the lifespans. Now, Diane drew this up years ago because we'd never found a similar one. You can find lists of how old people were, but there's Adam, the first man. He lived till he was 930. Noah lived till he was 950. And the sad thing is, you and I live on the wrong side of Noah. And by the time we get to Moses, excuse me, I've still got that cold, he's dead at 120. And you and I are on his wrong side. Climate change, after the flood, God told Noah, until the end of the world, there'll be seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter. Now, none of this should be new to you because we've produced 4 or 5 different video programs. Joseph is the last one to deal with the ice in Iceland, and he may come back to that. But you see, the Bible is basically saying there's no winter, there's no summer, there's no cold, and there's no heat until after the flood of Noah. No wonder things changed. It was much harder to live in a post-flood world. Abraham only lasted 175 years. The lifespan of creatures, of plants, of humans, of animals is diminished by the climate particularly. It's really hard to live out in the desert. I've been out in the desert, there's almost no food there. Easy to find rocks, but I tell you what, struggling to survive in winter as well as in summer. The real history of weather, by the time you get up to Job, you find winter is mentioned, so it's possibly going to get colder, but ice and snow and hail are not mentioned till Job. And Job is one of these anomalies in the Bible. It's very hard to place where Job lived. There's no references to Israel that can easily be proved, but we do know he lived after Noah, and we do know he lasted for 300 years. So he seemed to outlive Abraham by ages, but he didn't live as long as Shem. Now, by the time you get past Job and you get into Abraham, drought is a prevalent feature. By the time you get to Moses, there's drought, there's floods, there's winter, there's summer, there's erratic climate, and you and I live in that erratic climate zone. All right, there's one erratic climate that I've been to. I've been there in summer, I've been there in winter. In summer, it's beautifully green. In winter, brrr, look, I mean, walking in that frost, my feet froze. Look at that. One of my friends took that picture in an ice cave. Wow, fantastic. Beautiful, but beautiful enough to kill you. So no longer is the world very good when ice comes. I mean, it looks spectacular looking down that valley. Wow. But Alaska, notice, even if it's covered by ice in winter, there are many times when the exposure in summer is not even enough to get more than lichens and algae growing at all. Yep, I took that picture. Isn't that pretty? That's about what you get growing. There's a few dead pine trees from obvious times when the pine trees have grown well, but mostly these days you just get a tiny little bog sort of fauna. You get some animals that can survive on that all year because they can dig down through the snow. Summertime, there's enough food for them to really grow wild, and that they mate in the warm and the green. Beautiful lifespan, beautiful area, but only in summer. And in winter, unless you are adapted and you already can dig through the snow, because, I mean, look at their long legs. If you didn't have long legs, you'd never last in the snow at all. Diane's going to talk a bit about that sort of thing a bit later. And look at some of the beautiful birds that fly into the area, because in summertime, these ponds are actually rife. Oh, we're in Alaska, and of course in Alaska, as well as much of northern Canada, their national bird is the mosquito, because they grow pretty big and they're pretty fearsome. There's also interesting bears. No, that's not a polar bear because it's the wrong colour. But I'm going to leave all that to Diane. But look what he's eating. He's eating that nice big fish. There's his normal diet. I know that because I've done exploration in Alaska, and you have to learn how to tell when the vicious bears, the polar bears, the grizzlies, etc. Well, look, most of them eat grass for much of the year because that's all that's there. Once a year, they'll eat salmon, so their big teeth are not for killing things. Most of the time, they eat blueberries. That's how you know where they are. Their poop is a beautiful blue. Now, I'm serious. That's when you know they're around. Or these are the guys you need to be aware of. White. Well, I remember one explorer telling me, listen, there's a big grizzly bear cross. You know, the grizzly bear that's sort of white-grey, and he's crossed with a polar bear. Watch out for him because he's nearly 4 meters tall. They are big. They are strong. And if they're hungry, you need to watch it. I'm serious about that because I saw a group of bears on the next hill, and the boss of the bear little group stood upright, and you could see him sniffing in the air. I was on the hill over, which I was very grateful for, along with my friend and along with Magnum 44s and shotguns, etc. Because what the bears did, it was just coming out of winter. We were into spring, so there was enough snow melt for us to move around, but he could smell us. And across that valley, he came and his girlfriends came, and they were after one thing, our hides. There's one where he's lost. We've got his hide in a museum. But you see, there's not too many people have been unable to get close up to a grizzly bear. But benefit of one person who's been involved in National Geographic, he's got a lovely grizzly bear coat, yeah, from previous days. Can you see when you go down through the beautiful white hair? Underneath it, you find the skin is black. Now that's fascinating. I wonder whether it used to be all black, or whether it used to be brown. How did we end up with polar bears anyway? Because if they're becoming extinct, whose fault is that? Does it matter? I mean, look, you pull enough hairs off, and this was done with permission of the locals and the governments, etc. So I don't think we've done anything illegal. You'll find that he's got absolutely black skin underneath. Well, I've travelled Canada, I've travelled through Alaska, I've travelled all through England, much of Europe, and this man is the guy we're talking about his theories today. He's Louis Agassiz. He's got quite a few things named after him. He was actually a sort of a generic creationist, a Christian type scholar, and he came up with a theory as a result of all the evidence he saw, and I'll take you through. He believed there was a time when much of Canada and much of the rest of the world, particularly in the northern climes, was covered with ice. So don't be surprised people come up and say, oh, you're a Christian, you believe the Bible. Where did the ice come from? Where does it fit in? How come it's not mentioned in the Bible? Well, it is. It's mentioned in the book of Job. In fact, God asked Job the same question you're asking me. Where did it come from? Let's start in eastern Nova Scotia. Can you see the gravel at the top? Can you see the chaotic layers in the rock here? Yep. Now I've been from one side of Canada to the other. Here's a ice debris quarry that I was in. Now, ice doesn't form very neat layers because the only time the water will behave in layered formation is when it melts at the end of the glacier. So you get little layered bits, but you get lots of stuff spread across Canada. Oh, see the stuff at the top? That's the very chaotic ice debris. Piles of rocks of all sizes and all shapes, gravel of all sizes, sand of all sizes, chaotically in beds, but enough to show you water's been there. But also, see that rock that's underneath it, the grey limestone in the quarry? That wasn't dumped by ice, that was chewed off the top by ice. How do I know it was chewed off? Well, you get onto it. Yes, we take our brooms even out into the field and we clean it off so we can actually see. On the top of the layers of the limestone are big scratches. In fact, going down into this railway cutting, you see the railway has cleaned off the edge of the cutting for us. We didn't need to polish any of that. And you can get up close and look what you find on it. There's scratches. In fact, these scratches turn out to be the results of the boulders that are being pushed along by the ice, acting as mini blades, and until they wear out and powder down, they'll create big scratches. Now, sometimes this has been very useful when it comes to minerals, because there's a famous story of one geologist who found some copper in a glacial boulder, and he decided, I'm going to follow the glacial scratches back. And he went right through the USA, northern part, and up into Canada, round the top of the Great Lakes, and sure enough, he found where the scratches finished, and that's where one of the biggest copper mines in the north was founded. You see, you can put your compass down, you can trace them. Sometimes you find the scratches have gone in several directions, so the ice has flowed several times through there. In fact, by the time you cross England into Wales, you will find that the same thing has happened on the border lands of Snowdonia and that. Here we are right up in Snowdonia, and can you see the scratches? In fact, get up closer. As you follow down the valley, many of the exposed rocks. So in Canada and in the UK and Wales, you'll find the evidence of the movement of ice. And Louis Agassiz in his original country was familiar with ice. As he travelled through Europe, he was familiar with glaciers because they were already there and they were moving slowly, and they had boulders in the front, and they would behave and scratch the ice present, scratch the rock present tense. So he wasn't just making up a suggestion as to what ice did, he could actually observe it. In fact, I took that picture high up in the air, and can you see the surface that's been moulded down? I mean, every bit of earth and that has been removed from it, and you can follow big directional scratches in the land. Well, when you actually have a look in between the mountains, you sometimes find little glacial pools that are all that's left of where a glacier would have once started. But you can follow the glacial valleys down, and if there's any ice and snow, and in many cases, you can find the ice and snow still there. And in fact, see that there? It's picking up rocks. Those dark layers are rock layers. The ice is cracking up. Everything's moving down the valley, usually very slowly. Some glaciers actually travel pretty fast, but whether they're fast or slow, at the end of the glacier where it melts, that's the pile of debris that's left. See, there's flat boulders, there's rounded boulders, there's boulders with scratches, there's boulders with cracks, and this has been dumped. There's big boulders, there's little boulders. So glacial piles don't get sorted out like stream debris. Stream debris will take the big boulders, put them in one place, little boulders, put them in another. Glacial, you can always tell if the glacier dropped its load because it will be pretty well unsorted. Well, here's a gravel pit that I took a field trip to. I was leading the field trip because I'd collected here many times. Can you see there's lots of boulders? They're all sizes. And occasionally there's some nice neat layers that may go on for 50 metres or 100 metres. And that's where the water has been melting more rapidly than it did at other times. And so you get rubble heaps and you get tiny organised layers. There, see? This happens inside the glacial boulders, and the rest of it just acts as a glacial pile. Well, here we are at the other end of the countryside, and can you see way up north, you've got layers of sediment, but then it's absolutely barren on the top. There's nothing much growing there. Funny thing is, when you go up the north of Alaska, you find plenty of evidence in the north that there was never any ice sitting on it. The death of the plants has been caused by the fact that it's freezing cold, but ice didn't build up. So Louis Agassiz took all of these clues, There's some parts of Alaska, particularly the north, where there's no evidence the ice has ever been there. There's some parts of Alaska where, from the traditions of the natives, we know they came down ice-free valleys as they crossed over the area. But the southern part, because I've been to the southern part, is full of snow-rich mountains that are producing glaciers. I'd watched some of them for 30 to 40 years to see if they really are melting. All right, there's a picture of the distribution of the ice. Do you see the North Pole there? You see Greenland? Based on the evidence of the rocks, based on the evidence of the distribution of the scratches, based on the evidence in Alaska, well, there's Alaska on the middle left-hand side. Can you see it's the bottom that was covered by ice, not the top? The top always was movable. The top of Russia may be famous for having mammoth piles of bones, but even though Siberia, which is that area there, is technically one of the coldest places on the planet, the cold comes because of the ice elsewhere. It has not produced ice in Siberia. It has not produced ice in Alaska. So there's a bit of an anomaly here. Even though Louis Agassiz came up with the theory that ice had been over much of the north, he had no idea how it got there. Neither does anybody that I know of, except for God's question. Do you know where the ice was born from, Job? Now, Job understood the question. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been a fair question of God to ask, because God was seeking, what knowledge do you have, Job? If you can answer my questions, I'll answer yours. Good technique. You might notice also that the ice is not evenly spread around the North Pole. You see, I was told at school that when it got cold enough, the snowfall actually built up and ice layers formed. Well, you mightn't have been up that far, but I'll tell you what happens. It doesn't snow. The snow blows around. The colder the air gets, once the air gets below sort of 0 degrees, the air's bone dry. It's almost hilarious to go to Alaska and see the ladies can hang their clothes out to dry at -3, -4, -5 degrees, because the water is absolutely gone from the air and it actually will dry out really quickly. You can almost get a cup of water and throw it up in the air, -10 degrees, and it almost evaporates instantly. Boom! Looks like an explosion. You'll see Greenland. Funny thing, wonder why it's called green. It was covered in ice. All the evidence tells us that. In fact, the finding of the mammoths in Alaska or across Siberia, which is a fact of history, and some of them are actually preserved so well the explorers ate them. How do I know that? I got their diaries and checked. That's what they said. Oh, and some of these beautiful excavated creatures are dug out and put on display, including the mummified ones, the baby ones that were born and then couldn't survive and are found buried in the ice and the muck. Some beautiful examples, and a new one just recently with hair still on them. So the funny thing is, we know that the mammoths were not actually equipped for living in the cold, because organisms that are designed for living in cold don't just rely on hair, they rely on fatty tissue. Well, here's the big mammoth at the park I went to check on. Mastodons and mammoths are sort of similar, but a little different. When you have a look at them, it doesn't seem like they were designed to be living in a cold environment. When you look at the creatures that survived, well, they survived. Well, I'll let Diane deal why they survived. She's coming up a little later. Did you see the big hairy models? When they first existed, the snow would not have been there at all. So did they survive because their body was big enough? Because they had a trunk that could reach through the snow? Because there's no food there for that creature to survive anyway. You find some of these big musk oxes, and they can survive because they actually chew on the lichen and the algae, and they actually have a pretty clever idea for keeping warm. They'll form these big circles and they'll insulate the ones that are in the middle. And then you watch them, and then they'll actually change places. Now, did they think of that? That's not a survival technique they would have needed before the ice came. Oh, in this cave here, yes, I like taking people to caves like this. Joe, I think you've been to one of these caves in England that I told you about, because this is one of the ice caves, ice age caves, famous because inside were full of bones.
I've been down that very one.
Yeah, that's right. Full of bones, and simply because of the type of bones. You go there today and you've really got to search hard. There's some interesting oil deposits and bitumen deposits around there coming out of the limestone, but that's a different subject. But occasionally you'll find bones. But what's interesting, the bones that are in these caves, there they are, muskoxus, hairy rhinoceroses, and hippopotamus. Hippopotamus? Yeah, hippopotamus. Where do hippopotamus live? That's right, in hot countries, in Africa. And yet, when these caves were the last refuge places where hippopotamuses in England lived, it was because they were sheltering from the cold that was coming, and they didn't make it. You see, hippopotamuses had no hair, they had no fatty insulation. They had either two options: one, to evolve fat and protection, or two, to leave. Well, I guess the third option is die out. They died out. Some of them left England and they've never come back except in zoos. Well, the question, are the glaciers melting? Well, yeah, I took that picture. Can you see the glacier at the end? If you look right up the middle right of the picture, you'll see the glacier is still there. Now, I've been to this glacier many times over many decades, and the last time there was no glacier. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, well, you can still see the glacier high up in the valley, but it was kilometres down when I first went there. I've been watching glaciers in Washington State as well, and there's no doubt about it. Many of the glaciers on that side of the coast have been melting. Some of them have been advancing, but most of them have been melting. Well, the last time I took the picture, you could hardly see the glacier at all. You had to go further up, round the corner, and poke your camera in just the right place. And there it is, stuck up between those two hills on the way to disappearing. Now, this one, why do I include him? Because originally, you see this green tree in the front? That's where the glacier was. And look, it's retreated in living memory. These have been melting beyond a shadow of a doubt. And the funniest thing is, it didn't take 1 million years for the environment to recover. Basically, what you find is these trees would march up almost at the same, I don't mean march as in walk, I mean the progress of the forest. It would start with a mature forest way down the valley, then the seeds and that would grow as fast as the glacier moved back, the forest would follow. It did not take millions of years of regrowth. I say that because people say, oh, if all the ice melts, the forest is ruined. No, the environment seems to regenerate. There seems to be rules built into the world that the greenies don't appreciate or don't estimate that God has outthought us in most of these areas. You see, there's the ice. See that face up there? Again, one of my friends took this picture when he wrote an article for National Geographic on the ice. You see the little fluffy flowers that are no more than 50 meters behind the ice? And as it goes backwards, these little flowers follow. They open up the soil. Behind them come the small shrubs and the grasses. Behind them come the little trees, then the bigger trees. And it doesn't take 1 million years to regrow. It's not too long before that's less than 1 kilometre away from where the ice is. Marshes, boggy trees, etc. And you would come along and you'd say, oh, mature growth swamp. No, it wasn't there 100 years ago. By the time you get down to the coast, you will find that the forest has regrown totally. You say, what? How did you get to the coast? Well, I didn't, but Captain Cook did. I mean, I've been there since then. But you see, when Captain Cook actually went to this area, he reported the glaciers were 1 mile thick. Wrote all about it, read his diary. Now, that's in the late 1700s. So from the late 1700s right up to the present, these glaciers have been melting back, and you would swear on a stack of Bibles in a court of law that is a mature growth forest. But it's no older than a couple of 100 years at the most. You know, we saw the same thing in Australia because my dad used to be in mining, and he was up in the tin mining areas of North Queensland, and we had a big political battle up there because they wanted to build a road up through the Daintree to North Queensland, and all of the greenies, bless their hearts, said, don't do it, you'll destroy the old growth forest. Now, the court case went on until the Premier, who was pro-road and pro-development, actually brought up a couple of photos. What were the photos? The area when it was undermining and basically every tree had been removed. 100 years later, it was a mature old growth forest, except it wasn't old at all. It had regenerated since the mining fields had been abandoned. Oh yes, there are people up in these areas now. And again, a reminder that the north of Alaska is not icy snow covered. The south of Alaska is. Having met with some of these Inuit people and gone onto their lands with their permission to look for dinosaur bones, etc., you learn some interesting things. Like they have religious concepts. They have an organized religion. They have almost idolatry type religions, except not quite. These are ancestral sort of things, but they do actually remember a time when they weren't there. And if you look at this is up in the local museum, so don't tell them I'm making it up. You'll find they have stories of where they come from. Now, that's what I find interesting about North America, because I've talked to the Dakota Sioux, I've talked to the Apache, etc. I've talked to the Eskimos. Yes, I call them Eskimos. I know that's politically incorrect, but let's be blunt. That's what they call themselves. It may be the white people who think that's politically incorrect, but I'm happy to use what they call themselves. This is the Chugach area, and they talk about coming from up there down to the channel all the way through the ice where it was clear and on from there. The Dakota Sioux talk about coming the other way. Why do I mention that? Because most European anthropologists say all the Indians came from the northwest over the Bering Sea and they went south, and you just insulted the Dakota Sioux because they say we came from the land beyond the sunrise after the big flood. Yep, they actually do. But going back to the Chugach people, that's what you can reconstruct. They've come across the area, and their looks and their language match the story. They've actually walked across the Bering Sea. Well, it wasn't a sea there, but it's actually a very shallow strait, and you can get through there. You have to be very careful. It's a very good protective area for the Americans to guard because it was easy to catch Russian submarines going through there. It's such a shallow place. It's like the British Channel, really. Shallow, drop the water 50, 100, 200 meters, and you can cross it with no trouble whatsoever. And in fact, you have to ask, in these days of threats about sea level changes, is this anything new? Doesn't seem to be. You see, on today's maps, you can go and look and bring up, because of the concern about sea level change, what would happen if the water dropped 10 meters, 20 meters, 50 meters? You get dire predictions, all the natives in the Pacific will drown or they'll dry out, etc. But it's easy to do the computing because it's done for you. You see the light blue section? You can walk from Siberia to Alaska simply by dropping the water 100 meters. 120, you can walk clean around the planet, basically. Yep, you didn't take a million years. You don't need to invent brand new boats. You can just do it by walking. There's a question I get asked. What if all the ice melts today? Problem. Now, I've seen ice melting. I've watched the glaciers retreating. I've seen it happen in quite a few places. It's not an issue we have much in Australia. There's not too much evidence of too many main glaciers on the mainland of Australia. But when you look at the ice that used to be, based on the evidence of the glacial piles, the movement of the scratches, etc., can you see how much of the north was covered by ice? Well, if you want to go, oh, by the way, Joseph, did you see the Hubbard Glacier there? Your family's been involved in this. 95% of the ice has already melted. It's interesting. You see, people are concerned about the melting ice now because of polar bears and penguins that Diane's going to deal with, but 95% of the ice is already gone. And the world hasn't been covered by water as a result. The sea levels really haven't changed a huge amount to destroy the planet. Well, there it is there. You know, these satellite images are fantastic. 95% of the ice has already gone. Well, there's some of the ice that still remains. You see, it's in southern Alaska, the northern part. So again, I want to stress that if you think the ice comes because of the cold, that's simply not true. Where the ice is, it will be cold, But where the cold is, there's not necessarily ice at all. Why the difference? You know, I talked to one of the geographers, and he basically said, we've tried every sort of theory, but we really can't come up with any answer at all. So to God's question to Job, Job didn't know the answer. And if we're brutally blunt, there's tens of theories. And so far, we know the effect of the ice on the people. We know where they could move. We know how they took the stories. But you know what's interesting? Not one of their stories includes, when we came here, we saw the ice come. Oh, we find out that when they came there, the ice was already there. So none of the folk traditions in the Middle East or in the far north or in the south or in Australia are any help at all. And the Bible asks the question. It doesn't give the answer. Well, God said to Noah, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. We were prophesied by God to Noah that winter would come. I'm sure Noah didn't understand the significance of that because he'd never seen winter. And Job told his friends, heat and drought remove melting snow. They certainly do. You have heat, the ice will melt. You have drought, there's no actually ice that can be precipitated. I'm serious. You see, when you go to the north, it is not the cold that makes the ice. If you have no moisture in the air, you can't actually get any ice whatsoever. So Antarctica, as well as the north of Canada, are some of the driest places on the planet. Try going out in the ice and snow with your skin not even covered by, nice Vaseline or some sort of oil. You will dry out. Job states that his friends are like streams. We mentioned this before, darkened with thawing ice. So we know that Job understood the question about ice because he tells us he experienced it. He knew about thawing. He knew that summer would ruin the ice. He knew that the heat would melt it. Melt the ice, melting the snow. So in Job's day, and we know he was somewhere in the Middle East, ice and snow had already reached the Middle East. But that doesn't tell you where it came from. You can follow the scratches like that famous geologist did, find a bit of copper, follow it back, and earn yourself a fortune. Even Job's critic, Elihu, describes God as the one who tells the snow and rain to pour down on the earth. Hey, does that get into your thinking? Is God the author of rain? Well, the Bible's emphatic, he is. God told Noah that it will begin to rain, one of the most accurate weather forecasts there's ever been. And then there'd be summer, then there'd be winter. And that's an accurate description of God. He's the one who tells the snow and the rain. God asked Job, have you been to the places where the snow and hail are stored? Well, probably couldn't have answered that question. Perhaps he had. He'd been up into the hills around where he lived and saw the snow that never went away. Well, snow that's stored becomes glacial. God asked Job, who gave birth to all this? Job had no answer. Interesting. But you see, Job lived after Noah. Job lived after Shem. Job lived around about the time of Abraham, a little bit before, etc. But reality by his day, ice, snow, and hail. Hail, damaging hail. Hail becomes a weapon that God will use even to destroy the whole economy of Egypt a little later on. I've certainly lived through hailstorms. I've seen the terrible damage. We had a big one last year with hail like sort of cricket balls, tough, hand size. You'd put a big hole in your roof that way. Well, here we are back almost where we started. In fact, in the bottom of that valley, we drove up a glacier. Scary, particularly when our driver sort of almost stopped. He pricked his ear up and we all heard crack. The ice had just broken. And he said, we've got to get out of here real quick because otherwise we'd be stuck as we went down through the ice, almost impossible to actually rescue. The ice and glaciers can be awfully trapping. Oh, here's an old earthquake result. Big earthquakes in Alaska. This whole forest here was dropped in sea level and then the sea poured in, covered the pine forest with salt water and then retreated. Well, it hasn't actually regrown. The salt water plus the cold plus the ice and the bog is a fatal recipe for actually trying to keep a forest alive. But it went up and it came down. So when you're talking about sea level, you can produce it two ways. Lift up the land, sink the land. Lift up the water, sink the water. Oh, you see, you've got lots of ways to change sea level that are not just because people are using too much salt or too little water or more CO2 or anything like that. It's got a sort of a fatal beauty to it because you can die in that cold. They build cities in Alaska, cost them a lot because the amount of energy they have to use. You need mines that are producing a lot more stuff per ton than down here to keep cities like that alive. Beautiful. Well, let's finish on what you might consider to be a controversial bit, because there's Alaska today, post-Job, post-flood, post-Adam. In the beginning, Adam would have had no trouble with any cold because there wasn't any. God made the world. The only terms used in Genesis are cool, because Adam walked with God in the cool of the day. So it was cool, it was warm. By the time of Noah, it was hot or it was cold. It was wet or it was dry. Back in Adam's day, a mist watered the earth every day. You didn't need your raincoat. By the days of Job, you could freeze to death. You could be bombarded to death. Can you see the history of weather has really been the same as all the other we've been doing? Good to bad to worse to now. In fact, it seems to be a degeneration. In fact, in the last days that the Bible talks about, have you ever pondered what the weather's going to do? Because if you were making a prediction based on that graph, even the weather is going to go further downhill. Well, here's my couple of interesting finish slides before Joe might want to take over, do a question time, or allow Craig to do a little bit on Tasmania. All right, so we have here, do you see the beautiful Aurora Borealis? Aurora Australis is the one down in the southern hemisphere, but these are fabulous electronic displays caused by the particles that come in from outer space and strike up this atmosphere. Beautiful stuff. But one other thing that is usually missed, we live in a day where Russia is regarded as a terrorist state. Russia is regarded as anti-Christian, has been for a long time. It may have a strong state church, but there was a day when the only people who came to Russia with the gospel or came to Alaska with the gospel were the Russians, right? Keep that in perspective. And there's the evidence. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So I think at this time we need to pray for Russia that the gospel might actually be expanded over there as elsewhere. Diane, you might want to come on now, or Craig, I'll let Joe make that call. But Diane, there's a few problems that you might want to talk about. Joe can decide whether it's time for questions, but that is the colour change of animals and things like that. Joe, what do you want to call? Question time now, or?
Well, my suggestion is that we, because we've still got quite a lot to cover, and we're already on our hour mark. So my suggestion is we dive straight into Craig's segment. We then have a bit of a break and we deal with a few questions and some thank yous. And then we do Diane's segment, which is going to look, as you just mentioned, John, into the animals. And then we'll finish up with me trying to sort of wrap some stuff up and get a few more details out there. So, Craig, if you want to bring your slides up in front of you, we'll put them up on the screen. And maybe you'd like to have a little bit of I believe you're talking about sort of like humans migrating, moving across the continents, how that links in with the Ice Age and everything else.
Joe, just to get in ahead, because remember, I'm living in the borderlands of South Australia and I've messed up big time with the time, so I may have to go during this presentation. So hope you've enjoyed it, but if we get a bit of time for questions there, I'll be here at the start.
That's good. That's good. So you think you're going to need to leave in the next sort of half an hour?
Somewhere half an hour mark, yeah.
Yeah, all right, that's fine. No worries. Over to you, Craig.
Okay, Sam. So, Joe, sorry. So the slides are up.
Yeah, they're up. They're actually over to you, mate.
Right to go. Okay. Well, just quite independently, actually, of John's presentation, I also found some information that indicates that the sea level had dropped 120 metres as well, the exact same figure. So this is not my number one area of expertise, I can tell you that. So it's a fairly brief presentation and mostly just relating to Tasmania. We did mention a little bit last week how the Aboriginals are well known to have walked to Tasmania, and for the same reasons that John's described, with the sea levels dropping, they could simply walk. And there was an interesting paper that I came across by Nunn and Reed that talked about this, and it indicates how past research has been done by coring off the continental shelf to determine where the sea levels actually were. But there's other ways they can figure this out as well, and that's actually from Aboriginal stories. So most of you will understand that the Aboriginals had no written records, but they had oral traditions, and these researchers looked into those, and obviously you can't trust most oral traditions because of the chance of Chinese whisper type things, especially over long periods of time. But these researchers thought that the fact that there's 16 different Aboriginal stories of sea rise in Australia after the sort of end of the Ice Age, that was room for sort of trusting them somewhat. But they suggested that these stories are at least 7,000 years old and may have been preserved for these several hundred generations. And they found that almost impossible to believe, although they did believe it. Clearly, from a biblical point of view, we wouldn't hold that was that long. And in fact, other science has suggested that through genetic measurements of the rate of genetic mutations in the Aboriginal population, they've estimated maybe 40 generations since they've been here, and that would add up to about 4,000 years, and that ties in beautifully with the biblical timeframes. Just as an aside, I don't know if this is a historical fact or not, but Tasmania apparently holds the record for the longest isolation known in human history. As I was looking at this, I also discovered that the Eskimos, when they were discovered in Greenland by Europeans, had thought that they were the only people alive on the earth at that time. But anyway, the Aboriginals were very isolated right down on the southern end of Australia. But it was estimated that there were only 5,000 individuals at the time of the first European contact in the 1600s by Abel Tasman, the Dutchman that sailed around and after whom Tasmania is named. But that's an incredibly low number, especially given that they believe the Aboriginals have been here for 35,000 years. So what would possibly be, I'll just go back to that. What would possibly be the cause for that? Well, the low number is well understood. Even when I was working in the government department some years ago, some of the scientific specialists there would raise this. It's well known. Why were there so few Aboriginals in Tasmania when Europeans made it here? One of the interesting theories was that they ate the berry of a mountain currant, a heath species, and it's believed that has contraceptive qualities. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But I think from the biblical understanding of time frames, and the Ice Age was really only probably a few hundred years after the flood. By the time the Aboriginals made it to Australia, and it's believed that they probably did get here in boats, maybe walked down through Indonesia and Papua New Guinea into the mainland, there wouldn't have been massive numbers of Aboriginals on the Australian continent, and certainly reaching down to Tasmania by the time the land bridge to Tasmania was still intact. And so my guess at it, I guess, would be to say that they only had a few individuals that came across it at that time. Wouldn't have been huge numbers, and the time frames are much shorter. So they didn't have time to breed large numbers. Maybe harsh climates and other things caused issues as well in that time. But it seems a little bit more understandable within a biblical time frame than the vast periods that they're talking about in secular understandings. But how did they survive the Ice Age? As John was suggesting, for Alaska and Siberia, the lowland areas around Tasmania certainly weren't ice covered. So there you can see the outline of the current coastline of Tasmania. The broader grey area is the previous land area during the Ice Age, shortly after, and the extent of the glaciers. So sometimes we have this picture of ice ages that just everything is completely covered with ice, whereas in Tasmania, really, it's just the central plateau and some of the high peaks where the glaciers were. The glacier is in black there, and the ice cap on the central plateau is the darker grey there, a little bit over in the northeast as well. So the Aboriginals could survive around the coastal areas, especially down the centre part of Tasmania in the lower country. Even today, the east coast of Tasmania is a lot warmer than the rest of the state. Parts along the north are quite comfortable as well. So back then they might have been able to survive. Interestingly, they had no known method of starting fire. So unlike mainland Aboriginals, the Tasmanian Aboriginals didn't have an understanding how to start fire, and instead they just carried a firebrand around with them. And if their fire went out, they had to go and ask a neighbour or a friend to reboot their fire for them. So I found that quite interesting. So maybe that contributed as well to their discomfort in the really cold periods. Now, just to move on to a slightly different subject, one that I'm a little bit more familiar with, but I came across a paper through the University World News talking about plant diversity, and it describes how the Ice Age extinction was the cause of plant diversity. And now that seems counterintuitive to hear a statement like that. And these researchers have shown by investigating the fossil records that plant diversity was once much greater, and that they blame the Ice Age, that it was the Ice Age that wiped vast numbers out, and this proves that extinction rather than evolution influences biodiversity. Well, I mean, this is just fantastic. This is what creation has been saying all the way along. This is reflects biblical history, and it's a great quote for us, but not for evolution, because extinction is downward. It's not an upward and improving and increasing genetic growth of diversity across the planet. It's a loss in all of that. So it's quite a statement for evolutionary-based scientists to come out with. In the Tasmanian context, we've got Nothofagus rainforest, and this is a picture at about 800 metres elevation in the northeast. The Nothofagus is an interesting tree. It occurs in cool temperate rainforests, but you can see there some of its characteristic. It can be a tree up to 40 metres high, or as stunted as 1.5 metres in the most windswept and colder alpine regions. But it does occur in the lowlands as well, and across quite a diversity of topographies and soils and so on. So it's quite a robust sort of plant. In fact, there's another Nothofagus as well that I also was exposed to in my time in New South Wales that occurs from about the central part of New South Wales into southern Queensland, called Nothofagus morii. And it's a very similar tree, and I would say it's of the same created kind as the Nothofagus of Tasmania, which is just showing that it can also survive in warmer climes. Now, going back to our paper, and I'll just tie this in a minute, they are saying that highly diverse sclerophyll plants existed under high rainfall summer wet climates based on the fossil record prior to the Ice Age. Now, this fits again in with the biblical story, i.e., as John was describing, warm, moist environment. Adam and Eve were naked. They had to be able to survive in a warmish climate. It wasn't pouring rain. We're told in Genesis chapter 2 that the ground was regularly watered from beneath, and this research that these people have come up with seems to support that. But they've concluded that the regional loss of the sclerophyll diversity occurred at the same time as a decline in rainforest diversity. In other words, basically all the plants. So sclerophyll, if you're not familiar with that, just means dry or leathery leaved plants, and the rainforests are, sort of softer, moister leaved plants with a lot more water available to them. So basically, they're saying there's been a widespread drop in diversity following the Ice Age. Now, I wouldn't blame the Ice Age for all of that. In fact, the fossil record, which is showing where all the diversity was, is obviously a result of the devastation of Noah's flood. But obviously, there was probably also other plants that couldn't handle the more extreme conditions following the flood, again, as John has described. And they found these results were unexpected. So it was previously thought that diversity that we see on the planet came from radiation, which is an increase in the diversity of plants because of the dry climate and poor soils that came along and fires and so forth. So plants had to evolve to put up with those things. That's what was believed in the Australian and South African context. Or because there was an increase due to accretion, which is adding on or an addition to the current species there in a stable climate. Well, we know the climate hasn't been stable, so that you can basically throw that one out. But also they're throwing out the fact that evolution has occurred because of the dry climates and so forth. They're saying no, extinction is the rule. And there has been no increase in plant diversity. There's been a loss. There's been extinction. So they're saying here the species that became extinct in the two countries during the Ice Ages were likely to be the most sensitive to rapid climate change. So the species that now grow may be more capable of tolerating rapid changes than predicted by current science. So this is where the Nothofagus example in Tasmania fits in nicely. This is clearly a species that's not sensitive necessarily to rapid climate change. It does prefer generally cooler climates, but it can handle the extreme cold and it can handle warmer temperatures as well in the lower parts of Tasmania in the relatively hot summers that we have here as well. Yes, we do get 40 degrees too. You people in UK have been suffering up there. So yeah, this is just an example of science that's actually reflecting biblical history, which we believe, of course, is the true history of the planet. So that's what I had for you today, and back over to you, Joe.
Thanks very much for that, Craig. That was great. And another aspect as well into this whole sort of, climate change, ice age, how it all fits together as well. So thank you very much for that. Well, my suggestion then is that we do a few questions and answers. Perhaps we start, Sam, with some thank yous, because I'm pretty sure I've seen some donations come through. And we might just be able to catch John for the next 10 minutes or so while we deal with some of these questions and stuff. And then we'll move on to Diane and myself. So let's see what we can do.
Certainly. Right, let's have a look. So we'll start off with donations first. So kicking it off, as always, it has to be Doki Doki with 149 US buckaroos. Red box of popcorn. I know I could use a snack right now. Again, Doki Doki with 5 US buckaroos. A Shiba dog saying "good job" while raising his thumbs up. We've also got another one from Doki Doki. 2 US buckaroos. A pixelated hippo chomps on a 1-up. I'm assuming that's a 1-up from a game. I don't know. It could be a drink.
Idea.
Who knows? The mind boggles with all the possibilities. We've got a super chat from Neil for 10 British buckaroos. Thank you so much, Neil. We've got from Brother Timothy, 10 US buckaroos. Jesus is the only way. Amen, Brother Timothy. Amen. And we've got another super sticker from Doki Doki, 3 US buckaroos. Hippo character in tactical gear. Does some tactical flanking maneuver, hand gestures. I don't know what I don't
what
know.
a tactical flanking maneuver is.
I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. And finally, we've got Iron Matt with 4 US buckaroos per character, exaggeratingly stretching his arm forward to offer a cup of coffee. Thank you so much, everyone.
That one I can understand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the humanoid pair, I think, would possibly confuse a lot of people, but oh well. And we have a question through a super chat from our good friend George Bond. 20 Aussie buckaroos. We do have climate change. It's called summer, autumn, winter, spring. I actually mentioned something to you guys. Diane, you sent something through, and I sent something back which you quite liked, which was it's not climate change, it's climate switching.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, the BBC and many other news and media outlets consistently get confused between climate change and weather. What we've been experiencing over the last week or so, and what George is referring to here, is weather and not climate. If you want the bigger picture on climate, you need the much bigger picture of weather, because it's all weather over a long-term period, right? So you do see climate change, especially if you study your history, and I'll mention a little bit about that in my section when we come to that. But you want to be looking at the big picture of things when it comes to climate, right? Basically things like temperature and weather patterns over a longer period. So don't get confused like the BBC has. Although, John, I think you picked up a pretty good article on the BBC the other day as well.
Yes, it was from BBC History, and it basically was saying it's a really worthwhile read because it goes through heat, it goes through ice, it goes through all the different sorts of temperature and climate events, the weather really, in Britain. And its basic theme is, what are we complaining about? We've had it all before, from extreme heat all the way through to massive flood, to mega ice changes, back to normal, or what we would appreciate as normal. And it's all been done before, and not one bit of it would have been caused by industry or CO2 in any way, shape or form. So it's a worth a read, BBC History, 10 points to them for being honest.
Indeed. Right. Okay. So, first question is it needs a visual aid. So bear with me 2 seconds. Right. Okay. So this comes from Doki Doki, who says, "Why isn't the saber-toothed tiger still around today?" Now, if you look at this cat here, would you argue that that could possibly be a descendant of the saber-toothed tiger? Because they have rather sharp fangs. What do you guys think? Yay or nay?
Well, it's probably not a descendant of the saber-toothed tiger. It's certainly in the it's quite likely in the same group or the same family or the same created kind as the saber-toothed tiger. Although is a school of thought, including the one that I kind of assign to, is that there's likely a couple of created kinds within what we would classify as cats, especially when you compare the big cats to the sort of smaller cats. And that is a technical term, by the way, big cat. But if you look at the saber-toothed tiger, it almost certainly would come under the classification of a small cat, not a big cat, even though it was a big cat in the grand scheme of things. In other words, it's in the same kind as the American mountain lion, the puma, right, and some of the small fisher cats and stuff like that. It certainly seems, well, it was certainly very distinct. There are certainly different groups of saber-toothed cats, and I've seen quite a lot of them. There was one guy in the States that we visited who had the largest private collection of saber-toothed cat fossils, right? And it was a pretty spectacular collection, and I wasn't at all jealous of it, but they are worth quite a bit. But they're obviously very distinct in the fact that they have these very, very large two canine teeth, which come right down below the sort of chin line, if you like. John, any thoughts? I'm sure you've come across these things before.
Oh, yes, certainly have. I suspect they died out because of those teeth. That initially these are your canines, and even today, whether you're human or some of the smaller cats, right about, you will get a degeneration which you've lost control of the length of that tooth, and you can see some definitely fanged human beings as a result. But if they get too long, it sort of pushes your mouth open. You can no longer use it for effective eating unless you have a big straw. So I suspect it's a degeneration, and it took them out. But to add sort of Craig's stuff to that, as a person who's grown plants since I was young, one of the conclusions I've reached, which is pretty provocative, I couldn't say I could prove it at the moment, but I've certainly met other plant botanists and that who agree with it, and that is that when you shift plants either through wind or transport from England to Australia, whatever, somehow the plant registers the change. It can react to it, but it then proceeds to push any adaptation that's within the possibility of its genes until one occurs that which matches the environment. It doesn't evolve, it just shows up the variations that are doing best in that environment. And so I firmly believe from my experience that the plants have a register of the environment, and then they will somehow select the combination of the best possible genetic expression of the genes they have to match the environment. So it's not evolution, it's a design feature which we previously not recognized, and enables the plants to detect not only the environment, but what change works best in any change in the environment. So that's a John Mackay theory only. Don't quote that as, John Mackay chapter 1 verse 12. It may disappear, but it's certainly an interesting thought.
Yeah, definitely. All right, Sam, one or two more questions before we move on.
All right then. Sorry about that, Nico. Unfortunately, they don't think you're a saber-toothed cat, although bite marks on my arm would say differently. So we've got a question from Shogiwa right at the top of the show. Do you have any thoughts on the old claims of people discovering Noah's Ark in modern times?
Okay, since I'm the oldest person present, even before I was a Christian, there were articles in a sort of popular media on the edge of respectability, a magazine called People. I don't think it exists anymore, but it even produced an article about a French archaeologist who went to Mount Ararat, and he brought home with him a piece of carved wood, which carbon-14 tested, given that's limitations, to roughly the historically accepted date range for Noah's Ark, right? So if you go to the top of Mount Ararat today, you won't find a tree-laden area where wood could be harvested or anything like that. So his claim was he'd found a beam or a piece of wood that was definitely human carved, human interfered with, and it was most probably a section from Noah's Ark. So that's the one bit that got me interested, even when I was just young. Okay, now going on from that, you will find that there are many fake claims about Noah's Ark, or ones that are unprovable, and therefore they've been victims or beneficiaries of modern PR. That's much more effective than what used to be, much more easy to spread conspiracy theories, if you want to call them that. And there's a lot of those, but I always encourage people now, did we actually see anything? Did we see a boat? Or are we building the boat out of our piece of stuff we found that may or may not have anything to do with Noah's Ark at all? So that's the caution I have. As far as I've spoken to people who've been to Mount Ararat, if you want to prove it's a center of the spread of civilization, that's much easier, because around the whole bottom of those ranges are some of the oldest archaeological implements and carvings and memorials that I think you can find on the planet. I think you can be pretty dogmatic about that. That in terms of dogmatism about the Ark, here's my suspicion. With a name like Mackay, I come from Scotland. When you go to Scotland and you look up your old buildings, look up your old castles particularly, you find, well, they're usually wrecks and ruins. But you actually realise sooner or later the reason you don't have a castle on the hill is after the invention of the cannon, it became useless. So the locals unpacked the stones and the castle is now down in the town. It's what made the houses. So I'm pretty sure one of the reasons why the Ark had so many rooms and was so big is that it could be dismantled and taken down the hill as a place to live in, or burnt for fuel, or whatever you want to have it. So that's the John Mackay suspicion.
I like one of the statements I heard from someone regarding Noah's Ark and finding it is that it'd be the second best evidence anyway. The best evidence we've got is that it's written in God's word.
Yeah, good point there.
Yeah. Very good. Very good. All right, Sam, let's have one more question before we move on, because we've got a couple more segments to try and fly through. We'll see what we can do.
This one has just come in from Crypto Tiger, but has very kindly asked for some more information, so I will oblige. Crypto Tiger asks, who built the pyramids?
Well, it wasn't the children of Israel, as is commonly believed, and it wasn't slaves either. I'm assuming you're referring to the Egyptian pyramids, because the reality is the pyramid structure is found all over the planet. And while it's easy to dismiss that by saying, oh, it's obvious that it's the strongest way of making a tall structure, so of course they just copied it, there's actually more links between them than just that. It's most likely a remnant of the Tower of Babel, right? The idea of building a tower to heaven. Most pyramids are associated in some way with spiritual aspects, right? Whether it's worshipping the dead or preserving the dead, or as a form of a temple, or some kind of an ascension into heaven, right? Particularly thinking about like the stepped pyramids that you used to climb up. So you've got all forms of pyramids around the world, from sort of Cambodia in Southeast Asia to Central America to Egypt to down into further South Africa and so on and so forth, right over into the Middle East and on and on and on, right? With regards to the Egyptian pyramids, there were lots of theories. Some believe that it was slaves. Some believe that it was the children of Israel while they were in captivity, but the Bible specifically says they built the cities, right? Not into the pyramids, which were completely set away from the cities because that was the place of the dead. Right, it was a memorial site of the dead. So who built the pyramids? Well, you'll find the Egyptian records state that they were workers who were paid, not necessarily in the conventional way, because they didn't really have coins or gold in the conventional way that we think of them as money today. They would be paid in either things like beer or grain, or a reduction in taxes, because taxes were interesting in ancient Egypt, right? The amount of tax you had to pay was determined by how wet the weather was. Right, they'd actually have Nile markers which would mark the depth of the Nile, because the Nile, as you know, would flood and would fertilize all of the area, and the deeper it went and the more it fertilized, the better your crops were going to be. So the deeper the Nile was, the more taxes you had to pay. So that was how the Egyptians worked their tax system out. So you would find that they'd pay in food, or they'd pay in accommodation, or they'd pay in, a life, basically. And that's really the document that we see, the overseers who would basically dish out the payment to the workers in order to build the pyramids. And a pyramid, when a pharaoh came into power, right, he would start building a pyramid pretty much straight away and hope that they'd get it finished before he died. So if you want to find out more about Egypt and the stuff we've discussed, archaeological wise in last week's program, we've got more stuff online. I recommended some of John Osgood's books, but there's a few thoughts about the pyramids in particular. How did they build the pyramids? That's another question, and that's going to be a bit more than we've got time to tonight, because the reality is we don't know in its entirety. But John, any comments from you?
No, apart from the fact that I have to disappear into the eastern desert from here. So I'll bid you all goodbye and enjoy the rest of the conversation. Diane's stuff is really good on the polar bears and penguins and things like that. And thanks, guys. And I'll be off and out into the sand.
Catch
Good
you later,
stuff,
John.
mate. We'll catch you a bit. All right. Well, my suggestion then is that we go straight on to Diane's program. You've got a little bit about animals and adaptation and stuff like that, I believe, Diane.
Yes, it's about polar bears and penguins, because those are two creatures that are regularly in the news, particularly associated with climate. So I thought it would be appropriate to talk about those. Plus, we have had some questions about polar bears and penguins. So let's have a look at one of those. And this was a question that was sent into our other website, which is dedicated to questions and answers. It's just called Ask John Mackay. We can put that up later on, the link to that. But this was a question that was sent in. Polar bears have evolved to live in cold climates if God made an ice-free world. Now, remember, John gave you a bit of the biblical history of the world. It started out very good. Ice is not a good place to live. So there wouldn't have been huge glaciers and snow-capped mountains and all of those things. They're not good places to live. So this person wrote in this question and then asked, well, can these things live in warmer climates? Because we always think of them as living in colder climates. And that's exactly what we have in the world today. Where do the polar bears live? Up amongst the snow and the ice. And they have quite an extensive range. So if we look at the world from above the top, as it were, above the North Pole, so we're looking down at the Earth, and so the land masses look a little bit distorted, but you can sort of work out where we are. We have Canada and Russia and Alaska right up near the top of the world, surrounding the North Pole, and we have Greenland. And the polar bears live along the coastal regions. In fact, their name is their scientific name, the Ursus maritimus, meaning maritime bears. So they live along these coastal regions around the North Pole, around the Arctic Ocean. So yes, these days they do live in very cold places where there's lots of snow and ice. So how did that happen if originally there was an ice-free, very good world? Could they live in warmer climates? Well, how do they live in the cold climate for a start? Because they obviously do. They survive there quite well in spite of all of the scare stories that we hear about them dying out. You ask the people who live up amongst them, and they know very well that they're doing quite well in some areas. It's patchy, but anyway, they have very thick fur. They certainly have a couple of layers of fur, very, very thick, really good insulation. And as you saw in John's presentation there, underneath that white fur is actually black skin. But the thick fur is very good insulation. Then they have another insulating layer, which is a layer of subcutaneous fat. So that's a layer of fat underneath the skin. It's very, very thick. And to maintain that, they live on a high-fat diet. They go out onto their sea ice and they hunt seals. But they are not exclusive carnivores, and we need to remember that. They will basically eat whatever they can. And if they can't go and hunt for seals, they will eat anything that they find. They'll eat plants, they'll eat dead birds, they'll eat eggs of birds that live around the region. They'll eat whatever they can. And in human areas where people live, that they are actually a bit of a menace, because they'll come in and try and eat the rubbish and the human food as well. So they are omnivores rather than exclusive carnivores. So they do survive in a cold climate reasonably well, because they are already equipped to be able to do that. But they also live in warm climates. I've seen real polar bears, but I've never been up to the north of Alaska or the regions around the the poles, the place where I saw them was actually in a very warm place on the Gold Coast in Queensland, near where John Mackay lives, where there's a marine park called SeaWorld, but I've also seen them in zoos, and they are in zoos around the world in some quite warm places. But zoos, and they live quite well. The zoos provide water for swimming. They like swimming, and they're quite good at it. So as long as they have lots of water to swim in, they are also fed a much lower fat diet, and that includes vegetables. And you can actually look up the website that for SeaWorld in Queensland, and they have their own page about the polar bears, and they just name the different polar bears that live in SeaWorld, and they describe what their favourite food is for each bear. And in amongst things like fish, which you would expect, are watermelons and figs and olive oil and various other vegetable type things. Now, every now and again in the hot summer in Australia, private companies and individuals can get themselves a bit of free goodwill publicity by donating a huge amount of ice for the polar bears that live in SeaWorld, and they do like that. So the zoos provide the right sort of environment, provide the sort of diet that enables them to cope in the warm climate, and the bears respond to the warm climate. They can adjust the thickness of their coat. In fact, all mammals can do this. They do respond to changes in the environment. Now, that is a true adaptation in that it is a genuine change that happens within a living thing. But adaptation is actually a design feature. You can't develop the ability to do that after the event, as it were. You've already got to have that built in for it to be of any use to you. So they can adjust the thickness of their coat, and they can adjust the thickness of the subcutaneous fat in response to living in a warmer climate. So they can actually survive quite well. And of course, the other thing that we know about polar bears is their white fur. And the interesting thing is the polar bear hair is not white because it's full of white stuff. It just lacks pigment in the hair itself. Now, as you saw in John's presentation, they're capable of producing pigment. It's actually in their skin, but it's missing in the hair follicles, so they don't produce pigment. And the skin or the hairs also contain air bubbles. So that makes the hairs quite reflective. Now, that's interesting because that's how those of us who have reached a certain age where you start to go mature blonde, otherwise known as grey hairs, that's how grey hairs are formed, actually. The hair follicles no longer produce pigment, and you do get air bubbles forming in the hair, and so they become more reflective. So don't think of your grey hairs as as a sign of age. Well, they are a sign of age, but think of them as polar bear hairs if you want to think of them as a little bit more exotic. So how can we relate this to the biblical history of the world? Why do the polar bears live in this icy, freezing, cold regions now if they started out in an ice-free region? Well, it's probably a mixture of a change in the environment and a change in the bears themselves. If we think about it, after Noah's flood, right, bears moved north and spread out. They live, the natural habitat for them is all in the northern hemisphere. They have been spread around the world to places like SeaWorld, which is in the southern hemisphere, by people shifting them there, but their natural habitat is in the northern hemisphere. So bears got off the ark just like all of the other animals that were on the ark, and they spread out over so the original population of bears, which would have got off the ark and bred and started to spread out over the world. They moved north and they spread out in those regions, east and west. And at the same time, the climate was degenerating and we got the coming of ice and snow. Now, notice we said about the polar bear hair, right? It's lost its color. The pigment cells do not, even though the bear is capable of producing pigment, something has happened to their hair follicles where they don't produce pigment. So that's not a gain in structure, having the white hair. It's actually a loss. So we've got degeneration in the in the bears themselves. And so it's interesting, the genetic studies they're doing now of polar bears and brown bears. And brown bears includes grizzly bears, particularly in North America, but this would apply in Russia as well. They've done genetic studies, and there are genetic similarities between brown bears and polar bears. And that would make sense, of course, because they are all the one kind. So how come there is this sort of separation between brown bears and polar bears? Well, there's nothing much that's going to hunt and eat bears, but they do need a bit of camouflage from human hunters, actually. And brown bears are much easier to camouflage themselves. I'm not sure where that sound came from, but anyway, brown bears are much easier to hide themselves in a forest because you've got dark light and shadows, and also brown rocks and brown trees and things like that. Whereas a white bear would stand out in amongst the normal sort of environment that you would get in a forested region. So it would be easier for them to be hunted down by human beings. And in fact, these days you do occasionally get brown bears that just lose their colour, still living in the forested and green areas. But eventually the polar bears, the white bears, would survive better in places which are further away from human habitation. So that would be the high Arctic, where there aren't many people. And so it's more likely a survival thing that they ended up in the very high Arctic, whereas brown bears stayed in the slightly lower latitudes. And if you look at the current range of polar bears and brown bears, right, yes, the polar bears do live right up there amongst Greenland, all of those northern islands of Canada and the northern coastline of Alaska and of Russia. But their ranges do overlap, and they can actually interbreed. And when they have been together in zoos, they can actually breed and produce fertile offspring. And again, that fits with the biblical history that they are really part of the one kind. So there are hybrids of brown bears and polar bears. There are good genetic studies of living brown bears, polar bears, and these hybrids. And they're also starting to do genetic studies from archaeological sites where they've found old bones of polar bears and brown bears, and they're pushing it back further and further. There was a recent story, they're trying to make a polar bear skull that they claim was 100,000 years old, had the mix of these genes. So no one's disputing that polar bears and brown bears are related to one another, and the hybrids have this sort of light brown or patchy brown sort of colour. So if we look at polar bears in the big picture of the history of the world, they were created for the good world. They could live in the good world quite well. They probably weren't white then, but there would have been variation in their coat colour. So they were originally created for the good world. They are now surviving in the fallen world or the cursed world, where we do have extremes of climate, where we do have ice and snow. So let's move on to another creature that lives amongst the ice and snow, and those are the penguins. Now, in our so whereabouts do penguins live? Well, they live in the ice and snow as well. And recently there was a story in National Geographic about penguins going south. And this was, as I said at the beginning, polar bears and penguins are used in the sort of climate debate a lot by the climate activists, that they are endangered and they're losing their habitat and it's all our fault. And this was an article in National Geographic last year. And the author of this was writing about his experience of actually sailing down to Antarctica. And he referred to a group of penguins called Gentoo penguins, and he said they're waddling further south into areas that were once too icy for them. And the article then went on to say, but the population of chin-strap penguins and the sleek black-headed Adelie penguins, which depend on sea ice, are declining. So he's telling this bad news story, right? Penguins are going south. They are declining. Well, let's check that out. So how far south can you go when you live in Antarctica? Well, Antarctica is about as south as you can possibly go. It's right on the bottom of the world. If we get orientated here, you can see the southern hemisphere. There, Australia on one side, South Africa on the other side, and Antarctica is right on the bottom. So it's as south as you can go. If you go any further than that, well, you sort of either fall off the bottom end of the planet, or if you keep going on the planet, you end up going north again. So I'm not quite sure what the problem was that polar bears were, penguins were moving south. They're already south, as south as you can go. Now, penguins, like polar bears, also live in coastal regions. And you have to remember that Antarctica is not a large ice sheet. Like the Arctic Ocean is covered in ice at the moment. But it is an ocean. However, Antarctica is actually a land mass. So if all that ice melted that you can see there on that picture there, it's one of those satellite photos that's been put together by a whole lot of other photos. If all of that ice melted, there would be a land mass there. And the polar bears can just live on the coast. They'd be perfectly happy to do that. Sorry, I'm getting the polar bears and penguins mixed up again, aren't I? Okay, the penguins. We're in penguin land, right. So let's have a look at the conservation status from the Australian Antarctic Program to check out the statement about them declining. Adelie penguins, you can look up the Australian Antarctic Program website, and it will list all these different species, and the conservation status is, quote unquote, least concerned. In other words, the Australian Antarctic Program aren't considering that these things are in trouble or declining. Now, what about the chin-strap penguins? Now, aren't they rather cute? They have this little line underneath their beak there, so that's hence the name. And this is a quote from the Australian Antarctic Program website. Chin-strap penguins are an abundant penguin species in the Antarctic and sub-Antarctic regions. Now, sub doesn't mean further south. It means in the regions that are there before you get to Antarctica, in the islands, in the Southern Ocean. And again, their conservation status is described as least concerned. So where do penguins live? Well, some of them live in the Galapagos Islands. And the Galapagos Islands are actually in the tropics. And you can see from this photo here, that looks like a very warm, balmy place. It's actually only a couple of degrees below the equator. So in their natural environment, all penguins do actually live below the equator, but some of them only just below the equator. They live in the southern hemisphere. A lot of them do live further south. Now, why do they do that? Again, it's like the polar bears. When animals spread out over the earth, they spread out to wherever they could survive. So here is the current range of penguins, and you can see it's very extensive. A lot of them live in the islands in the Southern Ocean, which is why they've coloured the area around Antarctica, the Antarctic Ocean there. They live in the southern regions of Australia, around New Zealand, in South Africa, all the way up the western edge of South America and onto the Galapagos Islands, so up into just underneath the equator. So they can live in quite warm places, and they can live in very cold places. They live wherever they can survive. And because they have the ability to survive in cold weather, and because they, same way as the polar bears do, they have good insulation, they have good from subcutaneous fat and from feathers rather than fur, and they live on a diet of fish, so they have a high-fat diet. They can survive. So again, penguins were created for the good world. They can live in warm environments as well as cold environments, but they are now surviving in the fallen world, and so they do survive in places where there aren't things that are going to go eating them, and so that's why they are abundant down in the Southern Ocean and down along the shores of Antarctica. But as long as they can live in the coastal regions, as long as there's coastal regions for them to live on, and as long as there's a sea full of fish for them to fish in, they will survive. So if we can go back to us now, and if there are any questions about that or any further questions from what any of us have said during the time. How much time do we have left? I think we might be getting...
We technically have about 2 minutes left, but I'm sure
2 minutes. Sorry.
I'm sure we can go a little bit over. I mean, I had a whole presentation that I was going to do, but what I think I will just do, let me see if I can pull up just one or two slides just to run through very, very briefly, because I think there's one or two things that should be quite important to to deal with. Let's just skip all of that bit and go from here, I think, just very briefly, and try and run down through some of this, and then we'll do some questions before we finish. Try and finish up in the next 10 to 15 minutes, I think. All right. Hopefully you can see that up on the page. That's a photo which I took, by the way, when we were in Iceland. Beautiful scenery, stunning scenery, beautiful glaciers. Really, a lot of I think about 10% of the island is locked up in ice. Of course, it wasn't that long back during the 1600s when there was no visible sea around Iceland in the slightest. Right, the entire country was locked in ice. The entire island, rather, was locked in ice. So let's give you a secular perspective of climate on Earth. So this was published in one of my first ever university textbooks. In fact, my first ever textbook was on climate change. And this is something that was published in there. You can see the reference. This is Earth's surface temperature over the last 2 billion years. This is, of course, from a secular perspective, right? And you notice one thing, the climate has been high, the climate has been low, the climate has been really low. In fact, it's been all over the place, up, down, up, down, up, down. Right? I mean, cold, 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 cold. In other words, according to the secular perspective on history, there's been an enormous fluctuation in global temperature over the last 2 billion years. Now, one thing's for sure, the geological record is a record of, well, past history, right? It was deposited, laid down, buried in the past. However, was it really the 2 billion years? Well, you can go and look at our geological programs. You can go look at our, carbon-14 radioactive dating, all the kind of stuff we do there. You know where we're coming from. We believe in a young Earth. But the interesting point is, from a secular perspective, there's been huge fluctuations. And there really is evidence of fluctuations in Earth's history, including these multiple ice ages. Now, multiple ice ages doesn't really fit into a biblical perspective, but of course the question that could be legitimately asked at this point is, well, if you believe that there were multiple ice ages in the past, then what caused them, including the most recent one in the last few thousand years that most people are aware of, right? Because of the Hollywood movies, the Ice Age movies, however many of those they've come out of, right? That's the kind of ice age we associate with the ice age of mammoths and saber-toothed tigers and so on and so forth. So what's the cause of an ice age? From a secular perspective, this is. Okay, conversation with my university professor, who was actually an expert in ancient climates, who was teaching this first ever course on climate change and ancient history. And this was a conversation I had with him back when I started in 2015. I said, what caused the ice age? He said, when you find out, do let me know. I said, do you mean you don't know what caused it? He said, I mean that there isn't a single scientist or climatologist alive today that knows the answer. They may try and give an explanation using the position of the Earth, its rotation, distance from the sun, and so on, but the reality is that none of them hold up any scientific scrutiny. The cause of multiple ice ages evident in Earth's history is the greatest mystery in science today. Well, there may be some who'll disagree with it being the greatest mystery in science today, but it certainly is a big mystery. What caused the ice age? And John dealt with this a little bit earlier as well. Is there really a cause? I mean, there's certainly evidence for a large amount of Earth's landmass being covered in ice in some point in the past. But how long was it, and what actually caused it? The reason for the mystery, you need a paradox in order to create an ice age. Two things which do not really fit in the way that we observe the world and the way that we understand the world. To give you a perspective, here's a question. What's the most effective greenhouse gas? If you've been watching our climate change, our programs on that, you'll probably know the answer, right? The worst greenhouse gas, or the most effective, or the one that causes the biggest, greenhouse effect, is actually water. It's water vapor, right? Water is an extremely effective insulator, and it holds heat very, very well. That's one part of the clue. In fact, most of the world is covered in water. There's a shot of the Earth from the Pacific Ocean's kind of perspective, right? It's almost completely water. It's pretty incredible how much water there actually is on planet Earth. And here's the problem. When the sun comes down, it passes through multiple layers. That heat passes through multiple layers of the Earth's atmosphere, including the one down the bottom in near the stratosphere, where there is a lot of water vapor. That's what clouds are, right? In fact, you might have questions about things like, well, what about a water canopy? There certainly seems to be an indication of larger volumes of water in Earth's upper atmosphere before Noah's flood, right? In day 2 of creation. I wonder if that has got something to do with it. I wonder if that's got a clue as to what could have caused an ice age as a result of Noah's flood. You see, your problem is when the sun is the primary heat source, well, in order to create an ice age, which is ice on the land, right, not ice on the sea, you need a very warm water, very warm oceans, but a very cold atmosphere. And when the sun is the primary heat source, if it's passing down through the atmosphere, it's going to warm the atmosphere in order to warm the water. And so you get a warm atmosphere and a warm water. But if the atmosphere blocks off the sunlight, you're going to get a cold atmosphere, but you're also going to get cold water. You need warm water in the oceans and cool atmosphere in certain parts, particularly around the poles, in order to create an ice age. You see, when the sun is your primary source of heat, both the atmosphere and the oceans are going to be warm, and you're never going to get an ice age. The ice age paradox, it requires warm oceans and a cool atmosphere. Okay, very briefly, let's have a look at Ice Age history. We already showed you this. Over the last 2 billion years, according to the secular sources, there's been cold and warm and cold and warm. So let's get a biblical perspective. In the beginning, God saw everything that he had made, and it was very good. Adam and Eve were naked, as we've mentioned many times, even just today, right? And they didn't freeze to death. They didn't burn and get cancer either. So one thing you can definitely infer from that is that the climate at the time that God created the world was significantly different to what it was today. Right? There were no deserts. There were no, ice deserts either, right? There were no glaciers, there were no extremities of climate, heat, or weather. In the beginning, Genesis chapter 1, God made everything very good. We've already mentioned that. And God saw that everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. That's the first step of this sort of investigation into climate change, ice age, so on and so forth. In the beginning, it was very good. The creation climate was also very good, and it was significantly different to what we experience today. Okay, evidence of ice age. Well, John's traveled all over the world. He's seen some pretty spectacular fossils, and here you can see, well, this is actually a trackway of a giant millipede. There's the model of the giant millipede. It certainly seems to indicate, because the climate was better in the past, the animals were able to get bigger. They were able to thrive better. They were able to be bigger in general, plants as well as animals. And then at the time of Noah's flood, you have the first ever reference to climate change. God told Noah, until the end of the world, there'll be seed time and harvest, cold, first ever reference to cold, heat, summer, and winter. This is post Noah's flood. In other words, something that Noah's flood did made a significant change in climate and also introduced the world to the kind of erratic climates that we actually get today. The real history of weather? Well, we've already mentioned today the book of Job mentioning ice, snow, and hail. The biblical view of climate: the earth has been warm, then cold, and warm again. I mean, we do it with our climate change programs, right? We give you examples of Noah, we give you examples of Abraham, we give you examples of Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Moses. And actually, you look at the history that's recorded in the Old Testament, as John briefly looked at earlier, climate's gone up, climate's gone down. So what about evidence for an ice age, and what could have actually caused it? Well, John has dealt with the great big scratches in rocks all around the northern and the southern hemisphere, scratches that are all moving in the same way, and the history of where this idea of ice came from. You come over to Norfolk and you see enormous glacial tills, in other words, sediment that is produced by the ice age. In fact, huge glaciers have actually taken flood rocks like chalk and shoved them up on top of the glacial deposited material from the glacial till. I mean, you can see it there. This is a place called West Runton. It's just a stark reminder of how powerful solid water actually is. Yeah, there's definitely evidence of massive glaciers and enormous ice age over incredible amounts of the Earth's surface. Here you can see some of the layers that water, frozen water, produced. Enormous layers of sediment pushed up over chalk. In fact, running down there, that dark red ridge, this is a map of Norfolk, right? That dark red ridge is known as the Cromer Ridge, and it's actually an enormous pile of stones and rubble and sand and sediment that, as the glacier was moving down, pushed it all in front of it and left it there where the glacier is finished, because the glacier is pretty much cut across Norfolk. So yes, plenty of evidence of the ice age for sure. There's a picture, the physical picture of that ridge. In fact, the evidence seems to indicate that is the extent of the ice. Pretty severe, really. You can see it sort of just came down into the southern hemisphere, some of the south of Tasmania and south of Australia, and some of the South America was covered, but most of the landlocked ice was actually up in the northern hemisphere. And you can see how it kind of cuts across the United Kingdom there. It was a pretty big glacier. It was a glacier that covered pretty much a lot of this northern hemisphere area. What about that paradox? Requires warm oceans and a cool atmosphere. How do you get that naturally? Well, the secular world has still yet to come up with a solution. Put a biblical perspective into place, and it makes a little bit more sense. On that day, the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Genesis chapter 7. Verse 11, a description of the start of the flood. In fact, it seems to be an indication of large tectonic activity which is taking place. I mean, we already see, and it's paralleled in Psalm 104 as well, of the land rising up out of the sea and the water rising up over the land, or the other way around, really, water rising up over the land during the flood, and then the land rising up out of the sea. Enormous amounts of tectonic activity which would produce heat. Large amounts of volcanic and tectonic activity producing increased aerosols and dust particles in the atmosphere means that you get a reversed greenhouse effect at the poles. Flood currents would force these warm waters to the poles, where they would stop the sea from freezing but produce a large amount of evaporation into the atmosphere, producing a so-called ice age. Yeah, it certainly seems that Noah's flood, or rather the after effects, the aftermath of Noah's flood, would create the perfect conditions in order to produce an ice age, in the sense of a large amount of the land being covered in ice, which we see the evidence of today. Rather interesting. Couple of quick quotes from Mike Ord, who's done a lot of work into this. I have calculated, he said, that at the height of the ice age, the average depth of the ice over much of the northern hemisphere was approximately 2,300 feet, or 700 meters, and that it took approximately 500 years to accumulate to that depth. This approximation was calculated by estimating the sources of water vapor, including evaporation from the warm ocean at a mid to high latitude as it cooled, and transport from low latitudes to higher latitudes. If we apply the melt equation to the ice sheet melt back around 33 foot per year along the edge, but slower in the interior, the gigantic glacial ice sheets after the peak accumulation would have melted within 200 years. In other words, you're looking at a total length of time for the ice age of around 700 years, less than 1,000 years. And remember, the peak of the ice age would have been a lot less than that, just a few hundred years for the absolute peak, which we see today. So hopefully that gives you a slightly bigger perspective. If you want to look more at ice age, if you want to look more at climate change, if you want to look more at evidence of glaciers and how they behave and so on and so forth, have a look at this documentary which we put out about a year ago now, Land of Fire and Ice. It's available on our streaming. It's available as a DVD in the UK. You can get it from all of our websites. It's an on-location adventure documentary dealing with climate change, the Bible, Iceland, glaciers, all the rest of it. And you can see me standing there in front of a extinct glacier called Okhokol, which I really do. It's got a fantastic history behind it, including one that relates to climate change. So go and check that out. But if you want the big picture, there's, according to the evidence, a biblical perspective on Iceland's climate history. Right? You have evidence just very soon after the flood of a very warm environment, in fact, Mediterranean or subtropical environment, evidenced by the fossils you find there. Definitely not flood fossils, as we know it's flood fossils, definitely formed after that, but then very quickly, within a couple of hundred years of Noah's flood, you have a massive plunging into the ice age, a massive drop of temperature, and then a steady rise and fall of temperature over the next few couple of thousand years. And you can actually match this pattern up around the planet, including here in the UK with the Roman warm period, the medieval warm period, and the Little Ice Age. So yes, Earth's history of climate is up and down and up and down. Well, I'm going to finish it there. Hopefully that's giving you a little bit of food for thought. Let's deal with one or two questions before we wrap it up for the night. But any thank you so far, Sam?
Yes, we do. We do have a few thank yous to do. We've got another one from Doki Doki. Goodness me. 149 US buckaroos at the Purple Cat. I think that was in response to my furry friend. Another one from Doki Doki, a super sticker for 3 US buckaroos, pair character punching the air with fist and bump written on his knuckles. Looks like he's been hanging out in the hood, as the kids call it. And Doki Doki again with 149 US buckaroos, a white unicorn with rainbow hair. So yeah, I didn't think I'd get a My Little Pony reference in there, but we managed to do it. There we go. Right, okay.
Well, before we dive into questions, Sam, can I just remind everybody of this newsletter? For those of you who weren't here earlier, John Mackay started really the first ever creation sort of magazine way back when he first got involved and really started a creation ministry in Australia. This is what we now produce. It comes out a few times a year, and normally it is only available in the UK as a electronic version. It's printed and shipped out around in Australia, but here in the UK it's completely free, but it's available as an e-print. However, because we have a massive announcement which is coming next week, so make sure you tune in. We've got a Q&A session next week, dedicated Q&A session, but we'll also have a huge announcement. We've actually got a 2-page spread all about the UK ministry, what's been going on, and what you can actually get involved with, especially with a brand new project. Really exciting. So because this is the global news, it covers a bit of everything, including that special UK announcement. This is now available for you to order a free copy of. So thank you very much, Sam. Go to thecreationresearchcentre.com and you will be able to order a free copy of this magazine. If you would like lots of copies of this magazine to hand out to your church or group, there's a link to do that as well. Basically, we're just saying any donation, and we'll send out as many copies as you want. Just let us know. And of course, if you're able to donate just £1, that'll cover the cost of printing and shipping this, but we do want to get this out there, so we are giving it to you for free if that's all that you can afford, and most people can afford. So just go to our website and fill that in. It's really worth getting hold of this, and also making sure you're signed up, because we would like to produce at least one print newsletter in the UK a year. But if it goes well and we can get the support, we'd like to be able to print all of them basically and ship them out. So let us know that you're interested. Certainly the best way of letting us know that you're interested is by going on right now and ordering one for free. So go and do that. All right, Sam, let's go and run through a couple of questions. We're sort of nearly 20 minutes over time, but let's just deal with 1 or 2 questions. Any other questions, folks, we'll deal next week.
Okay, so we've got one from Marianne Penelope James on Facebook, who says, question, is the Hubbard Glacier named after someone from Joseph's tribe?
Quite possibly. The Hubbard Glacier, I think John showed that earlier, it's in Alaska. It was actually named after, I believe, Gardner Hubbard, who I also think, if my memory serves me well, was involved in some way with Alexander Graham Bell, but don't quote me on that. But I think that's correct. What's interesting is he came from the sort of American sort of South to Midwest, and there was quite a lot of Hubbards who moved out there. Probably the most famous Hubbard of all was Ron L. Hubbard, who founded the sort of Scientology side of things. So we do have a slightly odd streak to us Hubbards. But if you want the UK perspective, it's an old name. It's an Anglo-Saxon name / semi-Viking name, and I traced my family history back as far as we go, and my genetics is certainly Viking, Celtic, Anglo-Saxon around there. And a lot of it comes from the sort of Norfolk up to Yorkshire, the sort of east coast of the United Kingdom. That's where most of the Hubbards seem to originate from, and a good group of those people moved over to the States at the time when they were all doing that, and kind of spread out in the sort of Tennessee, Alabama, and up towards sort of the north into Boston and around there. So quite possibly somewhere in my family line for sure.
Great stuff. Okay. And so we've got a question here for Diane. Here we go. Show you are. It says, how does extinction increase biodiversity?
That might have been from my talk, I think.
I think
Diane.
it was. Yeah. I think that was from your...
Oh, yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah, that's from Shoggiwa, wasn't it? Yeah. If I can just have first brief go at that, Diane. Precisely. I don't get it either. That was a direct quote from their paper, that extinction, not evolution, drives biodiversity. Well, of course it can't, because extinction is the death of things and the end of them. So it can't drive diversity. So it's a nonsensical statement. I totally agree with you. And that's all we can take it. That's as far as we can take it, I think.
Yes, it's the same sort of logic that I've seen in quite a few papers on biology in general and evolution particularly. They'll say that gene loss is an evolutionary process. No, it's not. Gene loss is a degenerative process, the same as extinction is a degenerative process. So they've got to put in their little homage to evolution, as that they seem to think that nothing in biology makes sense unless they put it through that sort of evolutionary mindset, whereas the real world is extinction, gene loss, all of those things, genuine change, but not evolution.
Great stuff. Good stuff. Thank you very much. All right, let's do one more question. If we have one more question, and we'll call it a night.
Yeah, we've got plenty.
I can see that. Yeah.
Okay, we'll do this one here. So Bold as a Lion says, roughly how long did the Ice Age last?
Well, I sort of briefly mentioned that right at the end part. If you go with my Gord's calculations, which I can't see anything particularly wrong with, you get sort of entirety for the Ice Age coming on the planet and leaving within 700 years. So somewhere around that, and that isn't even the greatest extent of the ice. The greatest extent of the ice would have only been a couple of 100 years, 200 to 300 years at the most. So yeah, that's a nice quick answer. So let me just have a quick look down the questions and see if there's anything else that we can answer very quickly.
There's one by Rare Broth Bastards that might be interesting, or we could save that for another time.
I think we should save that for another time. Thank you for the question, but that looks like we could get a lot into conspiracy theories and everything else with that. So maybe we'll deal with that next time. But you know what? We're 20 minutes over, so let's call it a night. A reminder to everybody: go and order your free copy of the Creation Evidence News if you're in the UK. If you're in the States, feel free to order one as well. But please do try and cover some of the costs of shipping. It doesn't cost a lot. A couple of dollars would actually do it, so we do appreciate that. But fill it in. It's out there online. Tune in next week. Big announcement, so make sure you're watching. Other than that, goodbye, God bless, and we will see you next time.
See ya.
Bye.
Catch you later, everyone.